thank you so much, Natalie Gunilla and Jessica Ludwig, for this opportunity and talking to Amu TV.
Thank you for the opportunity. We're glad to be here.
Thank you. So my first question is for you, Natalie. Let me ask you, tell us more about your institution, this George W. Bush Institute, and the center, the Presidential Center, why you decided to run this series of reports on Afghanistan.
So the Bush Institute continues to work on issues that have been of extreme importance to President and Mrs. Bush, both during their time in Washington as well as in what they call the afterlife here in Texas. So we do a lot of work both domestically and internationally. That work is done across 3 core pillars, from ensuring opportunity to strengthening our democracy to advancing free societies. And that work is very much rooted in core values of freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion. In terms of our efforts on advancing free societies, focus on Afghanistan, especially support for the Afghan people, in particular Afghan women, who are such a vital pillar in the advancement of free and fair societies everywhere. It's really been a core focus of ours since the Institute's inception well over a decade ago. And for us, we have remained deeply committed to that work. But in the last really 3 to 4 years, from the onset of the Doha Agreement to where we are today, that work has really amplified. We've worked with Afghan education advocates. We've focused extensively on issues of immigration, resettlement, pathways to safety, gender-specific needs of refugee populations. But in particular, this report, Captured State, which we recently released, really takes a close look at the Taliban's use of corruption and kleptocracy, its impact, the human cost of that impact on vulnerable populations, particularly women and children, and the international enablers of this mafia-like behavior. And for us, it was really important to take this examination through the work of our women's advancement portfolio, as well as our freedom and democracy portfolio, because we believe that anti-corruption and anti-kleptocracy mechanisms are actually some of the underutilized tools that exist to hold the Taliban to account. And in the report, one of the experts we interviewed noted, what you do to your women is what you do to your state. And I think that is really indicative of what the Taliban are doing right now in terms of Afghanistan, in terms of exploitation of the state itself for the pursuit of power and personal gain, as well as the exploitation of the Afghan people. And within that is the oppression of women and other marginalized populations throughout the country.
Yeah, I can see that in your report with the title, The Role of Foreign Enablers in perpetuating Taliban corruption in Afghanistan. You have focused on corruption and also kleptocracy in Afghanistan, the term that you have used in this report. Jessica, so what are the main findings of this report?
Well, first, I'd like to start by noting and recognizing that many Afghans have had a variety of experiences with corruption. But the reason we wanted to focus on corruption under the Taliban in particular is because the Taliban themselves have made a big claim that they are going to reduce corruption and improve the efficiency of the Afghan government. This is a claim that is central to their push for legitimacy, both among the Afghan people as well as the international community. So we wanted to test this. And what we found is that the Taliban are much more corrupt than one might be tempted to think, or one might think already. The Taliban are engaging in more than just opportunistic corruption, but in forms of corruption that are strategic, in that they really help the Taliban entrench themselves more deeply in power. They allow the Taliban to both benefit their own followers, as well as punish anyone who might resist their efforts at authority, at exerting authority in the country. And so what we found is that the Taliban are doing, they're engaging in many forms of corruption that might look different than one might expect. Because corruption is more than just an ask for a bribe. For example, when you're trying to transport goods across the border or through the country. And it's more than just a bribe to open up a business and the like. the type of corruption that we see the Taliban engaging in ranges from everything from leveraging their physical capture of the Afghan bureaucracy to award jobs, to manipulate salaries of different types of employees, to distribute licenses, to collect taxes. It also includes the theft and manipulation and siphoning off of humanitarian aid. We have also seen how the Taliban are using their position as gatekeepers over the country's wealth of natural resources as a way to both gain accrue personal wealth, and they are also continuing to engage in much more nefarious forms of illicit economic activity, such as narcotics trafficking, weapons trafficking, and even benefiting from human trafficking.
You know, Afghanistan, in the past 2 decades, the governments in Afghanistan were always accused for systematic corruption, and Afghanistan always had its government placed in one of top maybe 5 or 10 most corrupted countries in the world, governments in the world. So what is different this time when you compare the corruption of the Taliban with the corruption during the Republic? What's the difference? Are you trying to say that this is more systematic, the top leadership of the Taliban are corrupted, and that's why you used kleptocracy?
Yes. The type of corruption that Afghanistan has experienced over time has often been the result of infighting among different political groups and entities. And in some ways, because the bar was perhaps set quite low, admittedly, it is somewhat easier for the Taliban to make this claim that they are reducing levels of corruption, because again, they're able to reduce some of these forms of petty corruption. But when we talk about kleptocracy, we're talking about conversion of the state apparatus into a looting machine for the benefit of those who are in a position of authority. And in this case, that's the Taliban who are at the top. And we see different forms of corruption happening all along the chain of command. It's happening at the lower levels, perhaps more opportunistically. It's happening at the mid-level, at the provincial level. It's also happening at the very top by those who are members of the leadership of the Taliban and their close associates and allies.
So, Natalie, if I may ask you, so Taliban may have managed to reduce the corruption, the petty corruption on the very lower level, as Jessica was saying. But what about top level corruption, and what are some of examples that you find out in your report?
Yes, this is a really important question, right? And so in all appearances, as Jessica described it, it appears, that petty corruption has been reduced. There are examples of things like at the border, right? With trade coming in and going out, it's more efficient. There are a couple things that really should be scrutinized with that, however, right? It serves the Taliban's purpose to make trade and access to the borders, the trade of goods, more efficient. It is a lucrative opportunity to ensure these things run efficiently. It also is attractive to foreign investment and other bad actors who are interested in exploiting Afghanistan for the enhancement of their own personal wealth. We look at things like the emphasis on the mining sector and Afghanistan's natural resources. Again, you're going to want to make these industries as attractive as possible for foreign governments, foreign entities to engage in, because it increases the pot of resources then that are accessible to the Taliban. What is equally deserving of scrutiny then is the fact that where are the Taliban spending this money? They also claim through this clampdown on corruption, the fact that, customs revenue and tax revenue are, at significant levels, but this money is not being spent where it is needed most. And that is surely is in relation to essential services. I mean, you look at the fact that the vast majority of the population lives in some form of poverty, is facing some form of food insecurity. The fact that the healthcare system teeters on collapse, the state of the education system, and the way it has been both exploited, dismantled, and repurposed for utilization in propaganda and indoctrination is all incredibly concerning. The Taliban also have not made available, a comprehensive budget in terms of how they are spending the state resources, how they are utilizing the state resources. And so to claim that you are less corrupt, to claim that you are not kleptocratic, but to provide zero evidence to that fact, warrants increased scrutiny. And at the same time, we see this really as an important opportunity as well to connect the fact that corruption is not a victimless crime. Just look at the state of the vast majority of Afghan communities. There is widespread destitution. And so linking these two realities is really fundamental, not just in terms of calling account to the Taliban's use of kleptocracy and corruption, but also calling attention to the ways in which the international community can and should push more fully to hold the Taliban to account for their widespread human rights atrocities.
Okay, we will come to those mechanisms and your recommendations for how to keep the Taliban accountable. But as you mentioned, for most important sectors like education, health, agriculture, and to some extent the energy consumption of the country, the international community pays, right? So through these UN organizations, and we always hear that millions of dollars are going into the country to be spent by the UN organizations in Afghanistan. So do you know how much Taliban are earning from domestic revenue, like taxes and other sources of revenue, and how it's going how it's spent within the country? Jessica?
So we know that the Taliban, raised well over $2 billion in revenue last year alone. It's, again, there's not accurate receipts, so a lot of this, requires further scrutiny, and it's why data collection and transparency are so vital. In terms of where it's going, to the last points I made, it's very difficult to discern where it's going. Of the information that is available, of the budgets that have been published, or the resources that have been made available by various organizations, there's a significant amount of this revenue, these resources that are solely being dedicated to things like intelligence and security. And you can look at, too, again, how things like the education system have been co-opted as a propaganda tool. Certainly, some of these resources are going to the expansion of, the Taliban's influence and propaganda. You also brought up a really important point in terms of the money coming into the country. Theft of humanitarian aid is a serious concern. Afghan women, children, other minority populations literally are dependent day to day, life or death, on this humanitarian assistance. And in a number of ways, the Taliban have inserted themselves and are pilfering from those most in need within the country.
But what is the solution, Jessica, here? When the country is in need for humanitarian assistance, and we hear that more than 50% of the country is starving to some extent. So what's the solution? How we can ensure the Taliban are not abusing millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, which is pouring into country every year? What are the mechanisms to ensure that?
Well, I think the biggest mechanism is to really insist on transparency. And to date, we haven't seen any of that. We have not seen the Taliban publish any public accounting of how they are spending their resources. And so when very valuable things that are valuable and critical to the Afghan people who are suffering a significant humanitarian crisis, when aid is being delivered to the country, the international community needs to continue to insist on as many forms of transparency and accountability as possible. And this is really difficult because the Taliban have essentially captured or set up their own hundreds, perhaps even more than 1,000 registered non-governmental organizations that have positioned themselves as interlocutors to receive humanitarian aid from international organizations and then redistribute it on the ground. So this is one question that the international community needs to make, is who are they working with when they are trying to deliver humanitarian aid? The fact that it's very difficult for women to be serving in many of these aid distribution roles. I mean, they can provide another layer of transparency because just given the fact that the Taliban discourage interaction between men and women, it's difficult to ensure that humanitarian aid is being delivered to the most vulnerable population in the country, which include unmarried women or widows, because they're being left out of much of the current
But
system.
do you think that the international community could use that as a leverage to influence the Taliban? Because the Swedish committee closed in Afghanistan after decades of work and serving the population there, and Taliban, didn't care. The same is true about other organizations, which Taliban forced them to fire all their female, staff. Taliban don't show any concessions in these areas. Do you think the international community has still any leverage over the Taliban?
I think that's the challenge, right? And we should believe the Taliban's actions more than their words, because we have not seen the Taliban deliver on many of the promises that they have made about, for example, restoring women's access to education in the country. We need to take them at their behavior, and that's why we've tried to look at their patterns of behavior.
Okay.
And if their behavior is not demonstrating any willingness to change, that's another reason we've put out our series of policy recommendations, focusing on the Taliban's finances, is because we need to find another way to pressure the Taliban.
Okay, so you're talking about, Natalia, you're talking about the regional and international enablers for Taliban corruption and kleptocracy. Can you tell us who are the main enablers in the region?
It's really, really, really important that the international community starts to reflect on where enablement is happening. You have your usual players, there is, amid 2 decades of democratic backsliding around the world, we've seen this emergence of a new axis of autocracies, and they're really leaning into one another, learning from one another, and in many ways exploiting one another, right? So you have Iran, you have China, you have Russia. Russia was the first to enter into an agreement, a bilateral agreement with the Taliban. China has essentially sent their ambassador to Afghanistan and received the Taliban's designated ambassador, if you will. And then Iran has obviously really leaned in heavy to the longstanding relationship that they have had with the Taliban. But you also see the role of, mediators within the Gulf, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Turks as well. You have Pakistan. And what is really, really interesting is the ways in which, in one regard, you have, a lot of support for things like girls' education and, humanitarian assistance. But in other regards, when you look at some of the private sector institutions within these countries, especially in the case of, UAE or Qatar, for example, there are a lot of lacking safeguards and enablement that happens in allowing the Taliban to not just safeguard, but expand their assets. We also have seen things like the ability of Taliban leaders to send their daughters to school abroad, which obviously is extreme hypocrisy considering the realities faced by most
Natalie, do you have,
families in Afghanistan.
sorry for cutting you, but do you have examples of those Taliban who have sent their daughters abroad for education?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head with this question. So this is where, again, within the international community at large, and where our policy recommendations really stress is the fact that the data that's accessible and the coordination in terms of the sharing of that information really warrants greater attention and greater enhancement. And so some of the things that are outlined within our recommendations are, the utilization and expansion of what is called a PEP list, so politically exposed persons. So those in and around Taliban leaders. You also have the fact that, a vast number of Taliban leaders are not currently named on the UN sanctions list that is utilized by the 1988 committee, which oversees the current list of sanctions imposed on Taliban leaders. There was an incredibly concerning case several months back where a Taliban official traveled to The Hague, supposedly at the invitation of the WHO. Once he had access to a Schengen visa, he was able to travel to multiple countries within Europe, really unchecked. And everyone was surprised that this happened, but he's not on the sanctions list. And for those who are sanctioned, there have been regular exemptions granted, not just in terms of access to travel to places like China and Russia for bilateral discussions, business talks, the like, which China and Russia have paid for, but also Taliban leaders have been able to travel to Turkey quite regularly, sanctions leaders, to access medical care. Meanwhile, women and children don't have access to even the most basic form of medical care within the country.
We have heard that Taliban ministers fly to Turkey for healthcare and receiving treatment there. As you said, women in Afghanistan are not allowed to go to medical universities to become doctors and to serve other women in the country. So you mentioned...
And can I just say there is documented proof, right? Every time one of these travel ban exemptions is approved, on the UN Security Council website, it is listed. It is listed not indefinitely, but it is listed. And so, it's not just hearsay. This is regularly happening. It is documented. The UN Security Council has to vote on each of these exemptions. And so these are areas where we see leverage, right?
Okay, so let's come to these enablers. You talk about Iran as one of the most important enablers in the region, and your report says that Iranian officials from October 2021 to February 2023 have met the Taliban officials over 67 times, which is a very big number, high number. And Iran has handed the embassy in Tehran to the Taliban, and Iran benefits almost $2 billion of flowing trade between two countries. And also Iran is recruiting fighters for fight in Syria for Fatimiyun division. How are these information and facts concerning United States and your government here?
Well, I think this should be a wake-up call for the government of our own country of the United States, as well as our allies in Europe and other parts of the world, because the international community's withdrawal from Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban to power have created a space in which other actors, even some of whom, such as Iran, may have historically had tense relations with the Taliban, are keen to move in because these countries think that they see a strategic advantage to developing some form of relationship and engaging with the Taliban. In the case of Iran, for example, as you were highlighting, Iran in many ways an attractive example to the Taliban because it's another example of a extremist interpretation of religious view that is imposed through the state, but also used to capture the entire country's economy. And so I think the Taliban leadership see a potential example in Iran of a model that they could follow to engage in corruption.
Yeah,
for the Iranians, it's the fact that the Taliban aren't willing to ask quite so many questions and perhaps seem to be poised themselves to benefit improperly from many types of economic.
But at the same time, Jessica,
a great deal for them. Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we are aware of the historical animosity between Iran and Taliban, right? And we remember when Iranian diplomats were killed in Mazar-e-Sharif in 1999 or 98. And we remember that Iran was supporting the Islamic State of Afghanistan, headed by Burhanuddin Rabbani, former president, during the first resistance against the Taliban in 90s. So how much you think this relationship between the Taliban and Iran is a strategic one, a strategic partnership between Taliban and Iran, or you think it is more of a tactical nature?
I think it's more tactical and opportunistic, again, simply because countries like Iran, Russia, and China all have big global ambitions. They want to be seen as power players. So do some of the other players who we see engaging quite heavily with the Taliban as well, in more of a commercial sense. There are many countries who want to use the situation in Afghanistan to raise their own profile. For Iran, China, and Russia, this is a big propaganda win, right? They are trying to challenge the democracies of the world, the United States, Europe, our partners in Asia as well, that they are stepping in, that they are capable of a portrayal, at least, that they want to portray themselves as big actors who can do big things, right? Mm-hmm. China, for example, gave very, very little money to Afghanistan's development during the 20 years of the Afghan Republic. But the Chinese people don't know this because the Chinese government controls information that's shared with its own population. And so now China is taking advantage of the lack of engagement by the West with the Taliban to step in and say, look, we are going to bring economic development to Afghanistan. Whether or not that pans out is another story, but it's still a propaganda win. And the Taliban, too, are happy to benefit from these types of ties because it gives them photos with world leaders that that give them an air of legitimacy as well.
Yeah, let me ask Natalie to step in here. So what are the interests of China in Afghanistan, according to your report? And is it only for the photo ops that Taliban are looking for, or it's a much more deeper relationship between China and the Taliban, especially given the role of ETIM, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, and others? What do you think?
Well, first and foremost, to your point on the photo ops, China is not interested in the photo ops. If you'll notice, it's only the Taliban that have released the photo ops in terms of their visits to China, the Chinese ambassador's visit to Afghanistan. It's really, really interesting in terms of how that imagery is projected. It's often solely coming from Taliban offices and not necessarily the Chinese per se, or the Russians per se. I would say first and foremost, I think the Chinese, again, place their priorities first and foremost. So this deep, meaningful relationship, I don't think is front of mind for them. What is front of mind is security, first and foremost. Secondly, Afghanistan is home, as Jessica mentioned, to a significant number of natural resource deposits that have not yet been extracted. And so whether or not the Chinese government will, follow through on some of the supposed deals they've entered into remains to be seen. But, locking up the rights, the access to those deposits is paramount. And so, there's a strategic economic interest for them there. And then I want to really reiterate the point that Jessica made as well. I mean, the situation in Afghanistan, the perception that there is indifference, that, it's what is occurring is an isolated vacuum, plays very, very well to the Chinese government's narrative and attempt to push against the United States and other democracies around the world to say that, our model and our engagement of the world really matters, and that, there is an alternative to the prior relationships that you have had with, the U.S. and its allies. And I think that is something that is a narrative that is not getting enough scrutiny in terms of the international community. I think also, too, what China is doing at the multilateral level is very different to what China is doing in their bilateral dialogue with the Taliban. And I think far more greater scrutiny, as we underscore in the reports, is needed to really unpack what China is doing and how they are manipulating the situation in Afghanistan for their own gain, whether it's from a security perspective, economic, or propaganda.
One more follow-up question on China, and then I will ask about Russia. In the past, China and Afghanistan relationship was usually viewed through the lenses of Pakistan, because China has this big partnership with Pakistan, especially the CPAC, but also historically. How much of China or China-Taliban relationship is influenced by China-Pakistan relationship and China's desires for BRI?
I think it's difficult to say at the moment, because I think the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan may be changing somewhat. I think I want to maybe go back and underscore a point that Natalie raised, which has to do with the security situation in Afghanistan. This is something that every international actor still has an interest in. And it's important for all of these actors to really question whether or not the Taliban are indeed the best guarantors of stability, peace and stability in Afghanistan, as they have tried to present themselves. If we look at the activity from terrorist groups that we are beginning to see reemerging in Afghanistan, this seems to indicate that the Taliban are not upholding their promises that were part of the Doha Agreement, which were to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a haven for terrorism. They seem to be ineffective or unwilling, or perhaps both in some circumstances, at reducing terrorist activity or activity by other terrorist groups in the country. We've heard about, there have been several high-profile examples of Al-Qaeda, evidence of Al-Qaeda leaders being in Afghanistan. We've seen ISIS-K launching attacks both within Afghanistan as well as now outside of the country in Iran and
Jessica,
Russia.
we don't hear much about ETIM in Afghanistan. So since the Taliban came back to power, do you think that's part of the deal between the Taliban and China? We don't really hear much about what the ETIM, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, is doing. We hear about ISIS, we hear about Al-Qaeda, we hear about Ansarullah, which is in Tajikistan, we hear about Uzbekistan Islamic movement and others, but very, very less or few reports about ETIM.
Well, I think there are still some questions about how extensive ETIM actually is, whether or not it's still a group that is capable, that has many members. The United States actually delisted ETIM several years ago because of these questions. Of course, for China, which has for Beijing, and which has launched a crackdown on the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and used this idea that there are many Uyghur terrorists looking to attack the Chinese people as justification for what is really a horrific and statewide and systematic repression of the Uyghur population in China. It's hard to separate the truth sometimes.
Yeah, but do you see any evidence of Taliban helping the Chinese government to crack down the ETIM members in Afghanistan, and are they handing over any members of ETIM back to the Chinese government? Do you have any evidence?
This is not something we looked into specifically, but one thing I will note is that the Taliban have said Huawei they've had conversations with Huawei, which is a Chinese state-linked technology firm that is involved in facial recognition technology and providing this in China's Xinjiang region. And there are concerns among Uyghurs who live in Kabul, where purportedly, if this conversation about a contract for surveillance cameras and facial recognition technology that would be used to improve security in Kabul, that they might inadvertently become targets.
Taliban had this campaign about for introducing this technology of facial recognition, thousands of cameras around Kabul city, which raised a lot of question about safety of people and those who do not agree with the Taliban inside the city. So, Natalie, let me ask about Russia. What are the stakes of Russia in Afghanistan, according to your report, and why you have counted Russia as one of the beneficiaries of corruption and kleptocracy in Afghanistan, as well as one of the enablers of this regime?
So it's interesting, I think, in the way that we've listed the countries within the report itself. And so I would say, in comparison to China and Iran, the Russian engagement in the Taliban is still an ongoing development, but it certainly exists. And so I think one of the most concerning moves that we saw early on, even before the withdrawal, there was the positioning, the posturing of Russia to, encourage an increase in relations between Russia and, Afghanistan. Likewise, after the Taliban came back into power, the Russians, as I said earlier, were one of the first to sign an agreement with the Taliban around access to energy and wheat and things of the like. And what I think is really important in terms of this is, again, to the earlier point we made, that what is happening in bilateral spheres versus what is happening in multilateral spheres is very, very different. I also think you need to look at the language that's being used within these multilateral spheres. When Russia and the Chinese government give statements in response to the human rights situation, yes, they may be holding firm in one way or another in terms of lack of recognition because of the human rights situation. But if you look at the language closely, it is very passive. Right. And it has become even more concerning as time has passed. Likewise, I think you're seeing the ways in which the relationship is growing in terms of what occurred recently in Doha, when all of the special envoys met to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. There was a group of civil society advocates, as there always should be. And the Russians, alongside the Iranians, refused to meet with this group of advocates. Likewise, the Chinese government, though, their response was a little different. Again, emphasis on taking human rights off of the table, focusing on the economic situation. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which this enablement is happening. And I bring up these examples in the multilateral sphere because, for us, and a big driver of this report is the fact that though the international community is holding firm on non-recognition, there's a very concerning, it's slow, but concerning trend towards normalization in one way or another. And from our point of view, that normalization is, validation of dehumanization.
Okay, but
and that's dangerous in terms of Afghanistan and every other geopolitical conflict playing out in the world right now.
But it's not just the countries of the region, namely Iran, China, and Russia, who are engaging with the Taliban to a level which you feel like it's normalization of the Taliban. We also see other countries, Western countries, including the United States, that they are engaging with the Taliban and meeting with the Taliban officials. Are you concerned? Is your report kind of concerned about this kind of engagement from the United States as well? Jessica?
Well, there's a difference between some forms of dialogue and engagement, but I think there are opportunities that can be leveraged when dialogue does have to take place. For example, the United States could set a very powerful example by insisting that, and as it has in some circumstances, that members of civil society have a place to speak, that women be part of delegations that meet with the Taliban. There are ways to leverage this strategically to send a message to the Taliban that they are not the only actors in Afghanistan. Right? They may have put themselves there by force, but there are the population of Afghanistan is much more diverse, and it is not represented by the Taliban.
Okay. Another question is about Pakistan. I see that you have mentioned Pakistan in your report, but why Pakistan is not listed among the most important enablers, like the top 3 or top 4? Given the history of Taliban and Pakistan intelligence services, which is mentioned also in your report, and also the fact that Pakistan has been benefiting from business with the Taliban, especially the coal mines, which Shahbaz Sharif, Pakistani Prime Minister, said Pakistan is benefiting over $2 billion per year from this business with the Taliban, and they are purchasing coal from Afghanistan with almost 50% discount compared to other markets. So why Pakistan is not counted or listed as one of most important enablers of the Taliban?
So the countries that we examined, and I think you've brought up a great question, right? And Pakistan is always within the conversation when it comes to Afghanistan. And any examination of enablement requires a focus on Pakistan, 100%. But that seems to always be where the majority focus takes place. And that focus is rightful, but that aperture in terms of who we are focusing on needs to be expanded so much further. And you've heard me use the word scrutiny quite a lot in this discussion. And I want to reiterate that now in the fact that we need to scrutinize where this enablement is taking place and where, indifference has allowed bad actors, as well as, I think, inadvertent enablers, right? So there are those who are very obviously complicit, but there are also those who, through their complacency, have contributed to complicity. And it is these actors where there is not enough scrutiny and where, the international community, both state and non-state institutions have an opportunity to push. I mean, we could have written hundreds and hundreds of pages for these reports. We already have 3.
No, I mean, Pakistan is for every citizen of Afghanistan. When this kind of reports come out, people see where's Pakistan's role. Even in your report, you say that Taliban's interim minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani, held a Pakistani passport provided by ISI for several years. And he is in the United States blacklist as a terrorist, and there is a bounty, $10 million bounty on his head. If he enjoys that kind of relationship with Al-Qaeda, according to your report, and if he enjoys that kind of relationship with Pakistan, again, according to your report, then why Pakistan is not listed as one of the most important enablers, besides China, Iran, and Russia? That's the question.
Yeah, I think, well, for one, the passport that you mentioned, that Sirajuddin Haqqani, the Pakistani passport that he had, has expired. And I think the relationship may be changing in some ways. We're trying to also look not necessarily back too far historically, because again, our reports could have been significantly long, and at the end of the day, you have to focus. But we were trying to look at the today,
his name
is
still in the State Department's list, so it's not very past its today.
Yes, well, yes, and it's on the UN list. But there is this growing tension, rapidly growing tension, right, between the Taliban and Pakistan's leadership. A lot of it centered, of course, on one. There's a certain tension it's played out, right, over the migration from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and Pakistan is sadly weaponizing and forcing many Afghan migrants who've sought refuge in Pakistan and pushing them back home to Afghanistan. Although some of these people, the Afghan migrants, have spent their entire lives in Pakistan, and don't necessarily know Afghanistan is home. But the rise of the TTP, the Tehrik-e Taliban, from Pakistan, this Pakistani Taliban, as they're also known. The fact that they seem to be gathering strength by using Afghanistan as a base. There's weapons trafficking over the border from Afghanistan into Pakistan that's probably helping to fuel this conflict. And there are also reports of Taliban fighters who are tired of sitting around. They don't seem to be pleased with the lack of fighting in Afghanistan, and many of them seem to be going to join the TTP. I think this is actually a huge source of tension for the current relationship.
Yeah. So let's come to your recommendations. But before that, I wanted to ask if President George W. Bush has read your report. Do you have any idea if he has read your report, Natalie?
So the work of the Bush Institute is reflective in all of its capacities, as we said at the start, of issues that our leadership cares deeply about. And so across every level of the organization, from our leadership down to those who work on the policy side, we're deeply committed to all of the programs, all of the policy work that we put out.
So with that in mind, it means President Bush has read your report and maybe approves the findings and also recommendations that you have mentioned in your report. So in your recommendations, you are saying that the United States and the international community should formally designate the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization to discourage foreign governments, companies, and financial institutions from conducting business with the Taliban. Tell us more about that. Why at this particular moment you think that's the right approach?
Designating the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization would effectively make it much more difficult for any international group or entity to do business and enter into a business arrangement with the Taliban, because they would formally be labeled as a terrorist organization. Right now, the Taliban we're seeing them publicize some very, at least purportedly high dollar value arrangements and mining concessions that they are giving out to foreign companies. So if the United States were to designate the Taliban a foreign terrorist organization, it would hopefully kick off a chain of other countries also revisiting how they view and label the Taliban. The Taliban, again, as I said before as well, don't seem that interested in tamping down on terrorist organizations and networks that seem to have established a safe haven in Afghanistan. And that alone should be rationale.
So you're saying if the Taliban are designated as foreign terrorist organization, then countries like China would not be able to have this contract with the Taliban. And Pakistan will not be able to, extract the coal mine, for example, or other kind of mines that the regional countries are interested to extract and use.
It wouldn't necessarily apply in that way, but it would discourage private sector entities from all over the world who are also interested in doing business with the United States or partners who are based in the United States. Again, the United States doesn't necessarily control the legal frameworks of other countries around the world.
Yeah.
But we can use our economic influence,
yeah.
right, to have an impact and have a ripple effect through the international economy.
Okay, so Natalie, let me come back to my previous question about President Bush. Our viewers in Afghanistan might ask, why the American administration under President Bush for 8 years didn't designate the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization during that time?
Well, first and foremost, I can't speak for President Bush or Mrs. Bush, but I can speak for the work of the Bush Institute. I was not in the administration, so it's actually not a question that, I feel I have the ability to respond adequately to. But I do think what I can say in terms of the realities facing Afghans today in Afghanistan is the fact that, it is haunting. It is levels of human suffering, levels of persecution, levels of oppression that are really unparalleled right now in anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And it requires greater coordination. It requires greater assertiveness from the international community to really push and stand behind the values that democracies hold dear. Because there are so many Afghans who throughout the last 20 years, stood courageously in support of a more free and fair future in their country and a more peaceful and prosperous future across the world. And that really warrants so much solidarity and meaningful support from the international community. And the recommendations that we've outlined, whether it's designation of the Taliban as an FTO, whether it's the expansion of the international sanctions, whether it's increased support for, Afghan-led media organizations, independent media organizations, as well as civil society organizations who continue to push against the incredibly restrictive edicts the Taliban have imposed, especially against women and minority populations like the Hazara.
Yeah, thank you. Jessica, another recommendation in your report is that United States should designate Afghanistan as a primary money laundering concern under the USA Patriot Act. Can you tell us about that and how much of a concern really that is for the U.S. national security, given the fact that still the United States is the primary funder of AIDS, humanitarian AIDS, which goes to Afghanistan, and there is a lot of concerns if those aids are ending up in the hands of the Taliban.
Well, for one, the USA Patriot Act was a piece of bipartisan legislation that was passed very shortly after September 11th attacks on the United States, when it was clear that terrorist organizations and entities use and take advantage of the global financial system to launder their assets and to send money anywhere they need or they'd like to carry out horrific attacks in other parts of the world. And so we thought it worth looking back at this important piece of legislation and looking at the tools that are available, and have made this particular recommendation about categorizing Afghanistan as a primary money laundering concern, because it's an opportunity to use our financial system to push back and have a ripple effect through the international economy. What that particular piece of Section 311 of the Patriot Act would do is it would trigger heightened scrutiny by financial institutions when there is any business conducted through their bank or any financial transactions that are linked to Afghanistan. This also needs to be done, however, with in concert with a greater effort to gather more specific information about who the Taliban are, because the sanctions lists that currently exist are woefully out of date. And again, as Natalie mentioned earlier as well, we don't have a full picture of politically exposed persons and close relatives and associates of the Taliban through whom they may be registering assets in foreign countries or using as conduits to, again, launder or send money through their networks.
So you have 5 main recommendations, policy recommendations for the U.S. government as well as the international community. First is the designation.
Report. There's 3 reports. There's upwards of 10 to 15 recommendations.
According to this last report, you say that Taliban should be designated as foreign terrorist organization. You say that Afghanistan should be designated as a primary money laundering concern under the USA Patriot Act, and also you suggest more harmony in the U.S. government's efforts towards the Afghanistan to bring about to enhance transparency. And the 4th recommendation is more about to invoke human rights and anti-corruption sanctions against the Taliban. And the last one is also to the international community should have more definitive role in confronting the Taliban's ability to exercise corruption and kleptocracy as well as human rights abuses. So from all these 5, which are the 2 most important, you think, that the U.S. administration today should implement, or the upcoming administration after the elections should adopt?
I think that the key lessons or the key recommendations that we wanted to convey are, 1, we need to think more strategically and more creatively about how we can hold the Taliban accountable, and the fact that we actually need to lean into this a little bit, because we have not seen the Taliban comply with their own promises to the international community. So after 2.5 years, it's time for us to consider some other options to hold them accountable, especially for gross human rights violations, of which corruption is an enabling factor, and in particular for the gender apartheid that they have imposed on Afghanistan, which is really an anomaly, right, in the international community. This is not something we see in any other part of the world. Our second, I think, overarching concern, as well as Natalie mentioned, is movement towards normalizing relations with the Taliban, this international recognition that the Taliban are seeking and campaigning and pushing so hard for, is a big win for the Taliban, and we shouldn't give them that. So the international community needs to work together to prevent that from happening, to slow and reverse any momentum in that direction. Because what the Taliban are really after, why they want this international recognition so much, is because it would give them greater access to money that they can then use to, again, enhance their own power, entrench themselves, and benefit themselves personally and as a network.
I'll just add that it's kind of like picking your favorite child. It's impossible, right? They all have different strengths and elements that make them endearing to you. But I would say that the only thing I want to add to what Jessica expressed is the fact that if any one of these, right, any one of these was moved forward, it would have exceptional impact, right, in moving against this, again, this very concerning, slow but steady appearance towards normalization. And that's really where we're incredibly concerned, because again, normalization in any form inadvertently normalizes dehumanization. And that is a very, very, very concerning and dangerous trend, both in terms of what the Afghan people are enduring day in and day out, within the borders of Afghanistan, as well as in so many other contexts around the world where autocrats and extremists utilize corruption, utilize kleptocracy, utilize violence and brutality for the expansion of power, the institution of obedience, and the enhancement of their personal profit. And all of this is done at the expense of the people who are oppressed by these types of regimes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica and Natalie, for this opportunity and for this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.